In April 1912, newspapers around the world were full of the tragic story of one of the most famous ships in history, the Titanic. At the time, the Titanic was the largest passenger ship in the world. It was nearly 900 feet long and over 170 feet high with 9 decks. It was owned by the White Star Line. The Titanic left the port of Southampton on the south coast of England on April 10, 1912. It stopped briefly at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown, now called Cove, in Ireland, and then started her journey across the Atlantic towards her final destination, New York. The Titanic was carrying about 1,343 passengers and 885 crew members. The trip to New York was its maiden voyage. Some passengers, in first class, were rich and famous. But most second and third class passengers weren't rich. They were people from across Europe traveling to America to start new lives. The story of the Titanic is so famous that everyone knows how the voyage ended. Just before midnight on Sunday, April 14th, as she was sailing towards the coast of North America, the ship hit an iceberg and was badly damaged. 2 hours, 40 minutes later, the ship sank. Tragically, there weren't enough lifeboats, and only about 710 people survived. In 1985, the wreck of the Titanic was finally found at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, 2.5 miles down. 100 years after the Titanic sank, people are still fascinated by its story. But while there are hundreds of books, television programs, and famous films about the ship's short voyage, many people still know very little about where the ship came from and the people who built it. The tragedy of the Titanic was very difficult for the people of England and Belfast, Ireland, where the Titanic was built. For many years, no one in Belfast talked about how they built the Titanic. But this changed over time, and today, people in the city are proud of their family members who helped build the great ship. There's a memorial to the men of Belfast who died on the ship outside the city hall. And tour guide Susie Miller has her own very special family story.
I can remember, as a small child, my grandmother taking me to see the Titanic Memorial, which stands in the grounds of Belfast City Hall. And she pointed up at the name Thomas Miller on the plinth and told me that that was my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather worked here in Harland and Wolff in the shipyard which built Titanic, and he had helped to construct the engines for Titanic and its sister Olympic.
And Tommy Miller has a special place in the history of the Titanic.
He's unique. He's the only one of the crew who worked on the construction of Titanic for Harland and Wolff and then worked for White Star as one of the crew.
Like many people on the ship, Tommy was leaving Ireland to start a new life in America.
Before my great-grandfather left Belfast, he said his goodbyes to his 2 sons, and he gave each of them 2 new pennies dated 1912, and he told them not to spend those coins until the family was all together again.
Sadly, Tommy was one of the crew members who died. But his family never forgot him.
My grandfather kept those 2 pennies all of his life, and he passed them down through the family, and we still have them in the family today.
But why is the story of the Titanic still so famous after 100 years? Susie Miller thinks that there are 2 reasons that people will always be interested in the Titanic.
You've got the biggest ship in the world, with the richest people in the world and the poorest people in the world, sailing across the Atlantic, and on the maiden voyage, it hits this iceberg and it's a disaster. And within that bigger story, there are all these little threads of stories, individual stories about families and people who were heroes and people who were cowards and people who were villains. So you've got all those elements within it. So I think those 2 things combined give you a really good story.